On Section 508, the refresh and accessibility. My name is Dan Mouyard. I am a front-end developer at Form 1. I've been working with accessibility for, I'd say, 15, almost 20 years now. I do a lot of work for government agencies, nonprofits, and stuff, setting up sort of the front-end technical architecture stuff, theming in Drupal. I also do a lot of accessibility training and teaching and testing as well. I was also involved a few years ago for the release of Drupal 8, like getting some of the new accessibility features there in Drupal 8 that were improving from Drupal 7. I'll go into that. So unfortunately, the two original presenters for this talk, Daniel Ferro and Karen Kitchen, both moved. Karen moved to Austin and Daniel moved to New York City. So I'm here as backup. So I'm not too familiar with this talk, but I'm very familiar with this subject. So just bear with me. It should work out okay. So just as a note, I am legally blind and hearing impaired. So later when we get to the question and answer session, you might need to speak up more for me to hear your question and maybe wave your arms so I can see you. And hopefully this will all work. So Form 1 is a digital agency, and we do sort of a full service of all range of activities. And one of the things we do that's not necessarily known that well is we do a lot of accessibility, auditing and testing, and sort of like helping out in addition to all the design, UX, and build stuff that we do. So first, what is accessibility? So how I like to think of accessibility is basically making something usable for everybody. Because I consider everyone to be disabled. And there are things such as situational disability, where you went to the eye doctor and you got the eye drops, and you go outside and you can't see anything, well, temporarily you can't see. And there are situations throughout your life, being in a crowded bar room when it's really noisy and you can't hear the announcers on the TV. All these different situations that everybody can go through. So there's this whole range of disabilities that you suffer from, and you have to work through. And so the goal of accessibility in web design and build is to make your product as usable and easy to use for everybody. And so, Section 508. So I think about 10 years ago, we got all excited because they were going to update Section 508. And we were really excited. We think, maybe they're going to actually catch up, because it was sort of outdated. And for about 6 to 7 years, I actually advocated people don't just ignore Section 508. I know it's a law, but just ignore it. Follow the WCAG 2.0. They did a lot of work trying to make things accessible, and they figured out what makes things easy for people to use, and they had all this great criteria for how to handle things. And so all of the sort of lawsuits and stuff that people got in trouble for, like with Section 508, all that stuff is covered under the WCAG 2.0. So as long as you follow that, you are safe with the Section 508. And there are some stuff with the Section 508 that are sort of out of date that you had to bend over backwards to try to do, but they weren't really relevant. People weren't using that particular technology anymore, for example. So what they've done, and they finally, it's official now, as of January in 2018, is the Section 508 pretty much matches the WCAG 2.0. And there's a bunch of different, some people call it WCAG, or WCAG, or WCAG, so however you want to pronounce it is fine by me. But it's basically, the Section 508 now updates to match what those guidelines are, so that everybody can access, computer systems, websites, apps that are produced by the government. And so so basically, so here it is. So by January 2018, everything had to be updated to match the WCAG 2.0. And there's a lot of criteria, there's a lot of really good documentation online, both on the Web Accessibility Initiative website, which is part of the W3C, that does sort of the standards for all of the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all the new stuff. And so there's a lot of rules that kind of go through, but instead of doing that, I'm just going to go through kind of a general guideline of what you should do, rather than just to all these specific line-by-line items, just sort of general ideas. So here for the WCAG, there are 3 levels: level A, AA, and AAA. So the single A is kind of like the most important thing that you need to cover, because if you don't do these, a large percentage of people who may have an impairment of some sort won't be able to use it at all. And there's AA, which is for something like not quite as blocking you from doing stuff, but that there still can be a hindrance. And so the AA is where the Section 508 actually wants you to meet. And then there's also a third level, AAA, which goes kind of above and beyond, so even sort of edge cases of kind of some sorts of areas. So like one, we'll talk about it later when we go to color contrast, but that's an issue where there's different ratings, like for the A, AA, AAA, and for the AAA, it's for the people who might have a slight disability, but the AAA helps them. So that's what the 3 levels for those are. So how do people still use the internet? There's a wide range of disabilities. There's people who can't see that well, basically any of your senses. So people who can't see that well, people who can't hear that well, people who may not be able to control their movement as well, and people who may have some sort of cognitive issue, whether it's temporarily or permanent due to some issue, medical condition. There's a wide variety of reasons behind why these things would happen. And so they use assistive technology to help them access, whatever they're working on the computer or their mobile device. And so here's a good example of somebody. And he uses the iPhone, and this is a quick demonstration of how he uses it.
I see you using an iPhone, but how does it work for you? Well, I'm going to show you. So a lot of devices have this thing that you probably never even thought to use or check out or anything. It's called accessibility.
Accessibility button.
That'll show you all different sorts of things, how to turn a speech on and off your phone to white on black, black and white, maybe mono audio. There's all sorts of different things to do. So I just use the voiceover one and it works incredible.
Voiceover on button.
But it's a very cool thing and it allows me to use something that has a touch screen
104.
just like you do.
Slide or double tap.
So each thing,
Double tap to open.
touch it once, it tells you what it is, twice to perform the action.
Notes. Maps. Stocks. YouTube.
And then to move to the different screens, 3 fingers to go left like this.
Page 2 of 4. Game Center.
So let me show you how some of this stuff works.
Twitter. Double tap to open.
So let's. Alright, so let's see what's going on in the Twitter universe today.
Chris Loyals. For those watching La Machine, the girl next to me is actually 8 foot tall, which is why I look short.
Why did I tweet something?
One new tweet button. Text field is editing.
Alright, so when I tweet, I generally cheat and use Siri. It's easier that way.
Dictate.
Happy Easter, comma, from the blind film critic.
Happy Easter from the blind film critic.
See, pretty innocuous, nice little tweet. So let's put it up.
Tweet button.
One of the things I don't think people get is when you talk to Siri, if you add the punctuation yourself, it works so well. Period. Alright, so let's try YouTube now. I mean, Jesus, this is our home.
YouTube.
So let's look at the bottom here. All the stuff is down here.
Selected. Feature.
Right.
Tab. 1 of 5.
I know her so well.
Most viewed.
Most
Tab.
viewed.
Search. Tab.
Search.
Favorites.
Favorites.
Tab. More.
And
Tab.
more, right?
5 of 5.
So let's go to favorites.
Tab.
See what's going on in the world.
Favorites. The Hunger Games. 2012. Star Bright Eyes Movie Review Star.
Alright.
340.
340 views?
Duration. 6 minutes. 9 seconds. 100% alike. Submitted by Bridie S. Long Lashes.
Bridie ass. Sorry, love. That's the way it says it. I can't help it.
Submitted by Bridie S. Long Lashes. The Hunger Games. 2000. Landscape.
So first of all,
Controls hidden.
how wonderful the weather is in Manchester.
Alright, so there you go. That's Hunger Games. That's the way YouTube works. Right? Thank you so much.
Oh. New notification from messages. 404. 04. At Buster. At Blind Film Criticum. It's only Palm Sunday. Twitter.
Well, it is, isn't it? Easter's next week. Wow.
Yeah, I always enjoy watching his videos. He's usually very, like, some of the UI they showed, kind of the older iPhones, the newer ones have sort of a different look, but he's a great presenter, and it's really interesting to see how someone actually uses their accessibility stuff. Okay, so again, we're not going to go line by line of what the WCAG 2.0 guidelines are. I'm just going to go over sort of the general big categories of things you need to address in order to make your website or your app accessible. So first is images. So images they have what's called an alt attribute. And so every image that's on your site has to have an alt attribute. Otherwise, screen readers will just say image, image, image. And it's annoying because you have no idea what that image is. And so you want to give that a good description of what that image is used for. So if it's used as content, you want to describe like what that image is. If it's used as a link to somewhere, you want it to describe where that link points to. And if it's just something that's sort of like a fully background image that doesn't really need to be said, then you give it an empty alt attribute. And you also want to be careful that you don't want to have, sometimes on websites you'll have like an image and a link next to each other. For example, like if you're looking at a news feed and you have like all these teasers and you have like, the title of something and the link. In most of those cases, you can give that image an empty alt attribute. Because if you use it to describe the link, whenever somebody reads it, they're going to hear that the image alt attribute plus the title right next to each other. And they're usually saying the same thing. And it's usually sort of redundant. So you need to be careful of when you put in text, alt text, and make sure that it's appropriate to the situation. And there's even cases where if you're a front-end developer, where we use CSS background images to put an image on something. And in most cases, those are just for sort of decoration, and so you don't need to provide sort of a text fallback. But if you do, there are several ways to do it, and one of them is to use the ARIA label and give it the ARIA attribute of an image so that it makes assistive technology know that it's an image, and it gives that sort of alt attribute. So next are captions. So captions are one of the things that I hate absolutely the most. I think last week I tried to sign up for the Drupal GovCon because I guess since the last time I registered I was deleted from the system. But the capture that came up, I could not use it at all. And I tried to switch to the audio only one, but it kept giving me an error. So it took me quite a while to even log in. And so the big deal with CAPTCHA is, one is usually it provides a large barrier for not that much of a gain. There's always going to be new technology that can game the CAPTCHA system, and it will never stop an actual live human from going through the CAPTCHA system and creating spam. So one of the things we like to use is something called a honeypot. I think in Drupal there's also a honeypot module, where basically it does all this sort of like detection in the back end, and it never really interferes with the user. It puts in all these, all these configuration, that sort of like deceptively checks whether the person that's using it is an actual person. There'll be like hidden fields and stuff that only, a robot would know that they're there, and they fill them out. So if they fill them out, they know, oh, it's not a real user. So next are headings. So every year they do these great surveys on all the people that use screen readers, and sort of go if all these questions are like how do they use a screen reader, how do they navigate pages, what do they like, what. It's really interesting because some of the things change over time. But one of the things that's always been consistent is the use of headings and the levels that they're in, making sure you don't skip levels. So like it used to be where people really preferred to have two H1 headings. One would be for like the site name, and one would be for like page of that specific article thing. And more recently they kind of tend to prefer where it's only one heading per page. So that kind of stuff is sort of like technical details that you might not necessarily need to worry about, but just know that, you always want to lean towards what users' preferences are. But the core thing you have to do is make sure that it does make sense. Because essentially it creates an outline, where the H1 is sort of like the main topics, and then what's next, with the H2 and then H3, and you have to go back to H2 for some of the things. So it makes it very easy for them to organize the content. And a lot of people just skip through the heading levels. Sometimes they'll do the thing where they can just read. All they do is read the heading levels, and they get a sense in their mind of like how the page is organized. And if you screw around with that, it really messes them up. So usually make sure that the headings are in proper order are very important. And this is also a situation where, the heading levels, have a semantic meaning, so they're very important to use. But it might not be exactly how you want them to look. Like sometimes you want this H2 to look like an H4 because you want it to be smaller. So that's the case where you use CSS to control how these headings look. But you want to make sure that the actual element themselves make semantic sense. So next, the links. So links are another thing that they tend to use very frequently to sort of go through the page and figure out what it's about. A lot of times they can just do an alphabetical list of all the links on the page. They don't even read all the text around it. They just hear what all the links are. And so it's very important to be specific and describe what those links are and what they do. So there's a lot of cases where there's like a read more link, for example, where someone is just reading through all the links, they just hear read more, read more, read more. They have no idea what those links are to. There are some cases where you can use like the text around it, sort of describe it. But what we like to do is you can use CSS to sort of cleverly hide text that screen readers can still read, but you don't show up on the page. And so we'll have a read more, we'll say read more about whatever the title of that particular news article was, for example, so that when they do hear all of the links, it makes sense to them where it's going. And you always want to make sure you describe where the link is going to, not necessarily, it's always bad practice to sort of trick people into going somewhere where they're not really sure. And it's also kind of hard if you're ambiguous about what that link is and where it's going. So always try to be really precise in sort of describing what it does. So next is multimedia. So for the most part, video, and they need to have what I call closed captions, and open captions. And they're very different types. There's one that I tend to use, where it's just all the text it gives you is just what is spoken. So like it only prints out the text whenever somebody talks. It's usually whenever I'm watching, a movie or something. That's usually the hardest time I have listening. This is also something called audio description, where for people who can't see at all, it sort of describes the action going on, not just what's being said. And I think there was a talk yesterday about a couple different ways you can do this audio description as a service, that whenever you create videos, it will create these automatically for you. A couple of things with video is you don't want to have it sort of play automatically. You want to give users to have control. Like give them the option to play it or stop it. Or if it's something that just happens, once, you don't want to have it to keep looping. Just have it do it once, and then they can control whether they see it again or move on. And again, just like with everything else, any sort of widgets and interactions you build on a website, you want to make sure that it's accessible to whatever device they're using. And so as long as you make it keyboard accessible, all of the other devices that they tend to use, like joystick, a mouse stick, switches, they follow that same sort of paradigm where it basically follows what the keyboard does. So for keyboard accessibility, it's basically just when you test your site, try to navigate through the site without using your mouse. Just using the keyboard, tab through things, hit space to enter. Use the arrow keys and try to make sure you can still get to everything that you need to. And this is another way you can sort of test for what I call sort of keyboard traps, where as you go through things, maybe like they'll be taken to like a modal dialog something, and for some reason the keyboard gets stuck there. There's no way for it to get back. So that's why it's always important to test with the keyboard. So color. So when you think about accessibility and you're working on a project, it's very important that all of the disciplines are thinking about it. It's not just something that you code, you know. So it's something that UX designers need to think about whenever they create like a, you know, an interface, and making sure that when they think about how they're going to do error messages and stuff, make sure it makes sense. Same thing for designers. They need to make sure that when they're designing something, it needs to be accessible as well. And one of the big things that designers can do is pay attention to colors and color contrast. And so this is the accessible-colors.com. This is one of the tools that Daniel really loves to use. He's the designer for mine, and he uses that to sort of help him pick out, you know, accessible color combinations. You know, so always make sure there's enough contrast between the background color and the text color. And this is the case where I really try to push organizations to use AAA for WCAG 2.0 AAA rather than AA, which is what the law is, because basically it was for selfish reasons, because it was always very hard for me to see a lot of color combinations until recently. So I always was pushing for AAA, just so you know, it would make it easier for people to read. And again, you want to make sure that whenever you're, you know, have any sort of interaction on a website, you always want to make sure that you are multidimensional in how you communicate. You know, you don't just communicate in color. You know, you don't just communicate in text. You don't just communicate in, you know, in graphic or design. If you try to use as many of those channels at the same time, it makes it a lot easier. So for somebody who can see and hear and, you know, read, for example, they get all these three, you know, channels at the same time with the same information. It makes it a lot easier and quicker for them to understand the page. You know, so it also helps people who can only see color or only be able to hear something. So if you have all that different channels of information, it helps everybody. So next to tables. Tables are one of the things that's kind of difficult to make accessible if you're not really familiar with how the markup is. You know, usually a lot of the demonstrations you see of code online of how to do table, it's just a table row, and table headers, and that's all it is. And so they generally leave out the important stuff where you need to make sure that all the columns and rows and headers are associated with the correct, you know, row or column or whatever it is. That way whenever screen readers read through it, and they read through like the table cells, for example, every time they get to a cell, they know exactly what row that's in and what column it's in. And again, accessible tables are also very hard to make responsive, and there's a bunch of different solutions out there. They all have their pros and cons. Some of them like delete table, some column, some of them sort of rearrange it so it's in sort of like a linear format instead. And you just want to make sure that whatever you do, make sure that it is still accessibly marked up so that it makes sense to screen readers. So next are form. So forms is the one where the web really got in the most trouble with accessibility. So all the early lawsuits you may have heard, like with Disney, with Target, those all had to do with forms. Like essentially, like they couldn't shop online because the forms weren't accessible. And so this is a case where you need to have, you know, UX design and the development of coding all be sort of aligned. You know, you need to make sure you stop ahead of what the error messages are going to be. Make sure that they make sense. Make sure that they show up in the right location. You want to make sure that the design conveys enough information, you know, not just using color, but using icons, using text. And you want to code it in such a way so that, you know, the underlying HTML structure, like the label of a particular form element, is linked to that element. You know, that way, if you just scroll through, you know, you're tabbing through when you get to that element, you know, in the screen reader, it'll tell you right away what that form element is. Whereas if it's not hooked up correctly, all you hear is that this is just a form element. You have no idea what you're supposed to fill out. And there's also other cool things, like there are, like sometimes there are, like, so in this case, your email at gmail.com, That's what's called a placeholder. And a lot of screen readers don't read that placeholder. There's usually an option that they can, but most people, I think by default, it doesn't say that. And so you still need to have a label. Okay, so tab index. Oh, this is kind of like what I was talking about earlier, where like if you're navigating a page by keyboard, and sometimes you'll get sort of locked in a certain place. It usually has to do with, some code doing something funky with tab index. So tab index basically just everything that's on a page, a screen reader or other assistive technology will go through it in the code, the source code order. It's usually from top to bottom. But there are situations where you want to change it, you want to skip that section and go down to the middle, for example, and you use the tab index in order to do that. But that usually creates more problems because you might have several different widgets on a page that don't necessarily know the other one is using tab index, and so the tab index numbers get out of order. Or sometimes it just sort of overrides it completely, and so you can lead to sort of locking people out of certain areas. So you have to be very careful with that. Usually you want to not use it at all. One exception that we do use quite a bit is the -1. And all that basically does is just something that doesn't by default not focusable, it allows it to be focusable. So that was one of the issues, like if you've seen like the skip the content link that's usually at the start of a page that you tap to it, shows that skip the link, and then it'll jump to the next to like the main content of the page, for example. If that main section doesn't have a tab index of -1, or if it's not an element that already naturally has focus, it won't jump to that section. It'll just continue like onto the header and won't actually skip. So that's what that -1 tab index is very important. And there are some Drupal modules that sort of have these to try to make it easier, but they end up ruining things. I think one we had problems with was the add this module. It sort of overwrites it, and it can really cause havoc. You have to kind of go in and manually update it so it fixes everything. And also the title attributes. You see that used in a lot of code examples, but in truth, most people hardly see the title attribute at all. It's like one of those things that they can turn on and enable if they really want to hear it, but in the surveys that we've seen, it's like 90% of users don't even use or ever hear the title attribute. So you want to use the appropriate attribute, like the alt attribute on images, or the aria described by, or aria description attribute. So next, a document. So documents are one of the things where a lot of organizations will put up PDF documents of something because it's easier. It's how they've always done things. And when you create these documents, you have to make sure that those documents are also accessible. And I think Adobe's gotten a lot better at it in the past 5-10 years at being able to make accessible PDFs, but you still have to know ahead of time how to do that. And even some of the software, like I think it was InDesign, where even if you design it with accessibility and you export it to PDF, it isn't always accessible. It doesn't always match up like it should. So you want to be very careful when you create PDFs. And then generally, we like to argue that if you have content that you want to give people, don't use the PDF. Just use, a web page. A web page is easily printable, and you can make it look nice, just like a PDF. And it's more flexible. It can be printed on different types of paper, where the PDF is usually just a standard size. But if you go to Europe, for example, and it's printing on different paper, it might not line up correctly. Whereas on a web page, it will work regardless of whatever size printer you're using. Okay, so the why aria. So WAI is the Web Accessibility Initiative. And it was sort of this thing that the WCC put together to sort of help improve accessibility. They're the ones that sort of worked a lot with the setting up the actual WCAG guidelines and all this other stuff. And they came up with these, what are called ARIA rules, which is basically making, accessible rich internet.
It's 10:30.
Oh, okay, we're halfway there. Accessible rich interface application. And it's sort of like it allows you to add to just like a standard div or a span tag, which has absolutely no semantic meaning. You can give it meaning. So like if you're doing like a complex, web app where you have all these user interactions, by default you want to use the standard HTML element. So if it's something that you click and it does something, make it a button. If it's something that you click and it takes you somewhere, make it a link. You don't necessarily want to use just a span and then use all these ARIA attributes to make it do what you want. Use what the actual semantic elements do. You get a lot of baked in stuff that browsers handle that you don't have to handle yourself. Save the ARIA stuff for stuff that browsers don't handle. So like maybe there's a new type of calendar widget that's not in the browser. You can use ARIA attributes to sort of help describe to the browser or assistive technology, what this div does. Is it a drop down? Is it something that describes something else? And so, so there's a lot of really good things that you can use ARIA for. The landmarks, which when they came out with the HTML5 spec, like the main element and the header element and the footer element, they got the sort of default, what these things mean, like landmarks. And unfortunately, the browsers at first didn't understand those, and so the common was to use these ARIA landmarks in addition to it. So you'd have like a main element, and then you'd add the ARIA role equals main. And so that helps this technology know where they are. And this is another way that people who use screen readers access and sort of help understand what the page are. So they know, okay, I'm in the head of the page. This is just where like, the site name and maybe some of the navigation. This is the main area where the content might be. This is the footer, which might tell me information about the author of the page, for example. And so there's a lot of things you can do with ARIA to help make it give more semantic meaning to your page, to help browsers and assistive technology understand. So Drupal accessibility. So Drupal is very accessible out of the box. Even Drupal 7, there was a lot of work put into Drupal 7 to make it accessible. And for Drupal 8, we even did a lot more work to sort of really polish it, a lot of stuff. So like a lot of stuff like with how Drupal outputs the markup for form elements, they're now all accessible out of the box. There's a lot like the core skip link, how that works. The core, how it naturally defaults to adding headings on block elements and stuff. Make it by default so that they are in logical order. But there are a lot of things that you have control over whenever you design and build a site that you sort of do on top of Drupal, and that stuff you need to make sure you make accessible so that you fall in line with the standard that Drupal is doing. There's also a lot of cool things that they baked into Drupal 8, such as like the tour module and the ability to create these modal dialogues, and they've done all this work with using JavaScript to give them the right ARIA roles and attributes so that people can tab to them. They also did a lot with what they call an RL interface, so as it goes through, like the tour module, as it goes through each different section, it reads the text that you can't see, but behind the scenes, it will read it out loud to screen readers. So it's sort of like an RL interface. Okay, I know exactly where I am, that's what this is, that's where that is. So even though you can't see it, it gives all that information behind the scenes. So it's a lot of cool things that in Drupal 8 accessible, to make it accessible. So there's a lot of here. So these are some of the things I think I already went over. So yeah, so like the landmark by default, the live regions, which is what I was talking about earlier about the RL interfaces. They use live regions to sort of describe. Whenever that changes, it gets read out to screen readers, as well as the roles and properties to help give more semantic meaning to objects that aren't using just the default HTML elements. Using field sets for radios, alt text required by default. Oh, that one is something you might want to double check. Remember what I said earlier, sometimes you don't want any alt text. And so whenever you're coding up a site, there may be cases where this particular image is only going to be used next to a teaser heading, and so we never wanted to have alt attribute. And so you have to go in and manually change the code so it doesn't require it in that situation. So, but having it required by default was definitely a big improvement over before, where most websites didn't even think about it, so they never added it. So Gesso is the name of the starter theme that we use at Forum 1. And we've done some things that's sort of on top of Drupal to make it things that Drupal isn't necessarily responsible for, but we are, as we sort of the front end code for a website. Most of the improvements in Drupal for accessibility are all in the back end, like when you're in the admin interface and going through stuff. You still are responsible when you develop a site to make sure that all the front end code is. And so our starter theme Gesso has a lot of that stuff sort of baked in. We put in sort of like reusable patterns that we use on, project after project, and making sure all of the, sliders, the pagers, all that kind of stuff, those are all accessible. And there we are at the end. So are there any questions? I know I kind of talked through a lot, but feel free to ask any questions on any of the stuff I came up with.
Hey, some water.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Our agency recently.
I'm sorry, can you speak louder?
Yeah. Our agency recently had a 508 compliance call for a government entity which will remain anonymous.
For a what?
I can't really say who it's for, but
Okay.
We were told that you had to use Tabindex by the people on the 508 side. I'm not sure why, but what is an alternative to Tabindex?
So the alternative tab index is to use JavaScript to control, like when you click on something, where the focus jumps to.
Okay.
Okay, and that is a lot of work. Like there's a lot of complex logic that can go into that. That's why you generally want to use tab index instead. So my guess is that if you ran into a problem due to tab index, it's either because something used tab index that shouldn't have, or what you saw on the screen, the order it should go in, wasn't in the source order. So like you're expecting the tab through the top, left, to right, because the source order for some reason, and maybe the CSS layout technique you use, you sort of shifted things around, and so it doesn't go exactly where you think it is. And that's where something that you can use tab index to fix. But again, you have to be very careful that anything on that page that might use tab index has to know about each other and know exactly, where everything is going. Any other questions, Jeff?
Can you speak to the accessibility issues of using paragraphs and how that affects accessibility?
So on the front end side, it's up to whoever codes it to make sure the markup is accessible. As far as the admin side, I don't think I've ever done any testing with the paragraph module UI. So unfortunately, I can't really speak to how well it's done. So I know, like in Drupal 7, the panels module is not accessible. And we looked into it, and it was going to be a huge lift. So I do know that a lot of the Drupal 8 modules, like the admin areas, have gotten better at that than the Drupal 7 modules, but again, they might not all communicate. It's kind of a thing where you have to, particularly the contrib module. Usually the core modules that are in Drupal 8, they've done a lot of work to make sure that the admin interface is accessible. But if any of the third-party contrib modules, might need to double check. Yeah?
Is there a good best practice for embedded YouTube videos?
For embedding YouTube videos? There are a couple different ways. Usually, like if you go to the YouTube site and you look at like share this video, and sometimes they'll give you an embed code. That embed code is accessible. But it doesn't provide the closed captioning or the audio description. So like sometimes, if the video you upload to YouTube does have the closed captioning, it'll come through in the embedded player. But sometimes not. Sometimes you have to create your own, for example. When you have the video on your page, you might have to link also to like a text description of that particular video. So, and again, the session that was yesterday, I think they covered two methods where you can sort of do that automatically for you. Yeah?
Is there an objective measure or guideline for what, for determining if focus is sufficiently obvious?
For determining focus
Yeah, focus of an item, of an interactive element.
of an item. So the basically two things. One is that it actually goes to that item so that even if you can't see the screen, you know, what's red next is what the actual screen would expect it to be. The other is the visual thing where, like, if you tab through something, like different browsers have sort of different defaults, but there's like an outline, for example, that you see, you know, around what is focus. And again, that's where you want to use the color contrast to make sure there's enough color contrast of whatever that outline thing is to make it obvious this is what's focused. So a lot of things that what we do is whenever we code up sites is anytime you give something that is like a hover, you know, effect, like if it hovers, it does this or whatever. We also do that so that if you focus on it with the keyboard, it also gets that same change. So it's kind of obvious that that's where your focus is on the page.
So this is one example I'm thinking of is a video player interface that we use. The focus that was developed for that, for items, for example, that are tabbed to, there'd be a sort of a slight color glow around the button. But it's kind of questionable whether that glow is obvious enough because it's not really strong.
Yeah, so that's what, like the color contrast is the one where you get the most, I would say, heated discussion with designers, because usually they like to design things to have sort of like these nice faded gradients that really look nice but might not have enough color contrast. So that's something where you have to sort of talk with your designer and say, hey, this is very important. You know, this needs to have enough color contrast. Whereas other times on a page where you have like a, you know, a drop shadow or something, those aren't necessarily important to convey information, so they don't have to follow the guidelines for enough color contrast.
So there's not any specific specification for specifically what kinds of focus on a button are acceptable.
So it's just making sure, like, so you want to make sure that it's perceivable so you can see the difference. You know, so that's where the color contrast comes into play. So you just want to make sure that if the button background color changes, that there's enough contrast with what it was before. If it has like the outer glow that you say, that the outer glow is enough color contrast from what's behind it. If that makes sense. So that color contrast difference. Yes?
How to add alt text for embedded Google Map?
Google Maps. Okay, so the last I read about, which I think was about a year or two ago, the Google Maps interface has gotten a lot better. Like they're kind of behind the curve quite a bit, but they a couple years ago they spent a lot of effort and made it accessible. By embedding it on your site, you just have to make sure that as people tab through the page, that they actually tab into the focus of the map, and you want to make sure that you embed it in such a way that it's using all of Google's APIs. You're not just sort of hand waving it, doing it yourself, and not giving all the functionality that Google does. Does that make sense? So like usually if you have a map and you can click in and drag it around and do all that kind of stuff, you're getting all of Google's work for free. You want to make sure that as long as you still do that, as long as you can still tap into it and do everything with the keyboard that you could if you just went to the Google Maps page, you're pretty much covered. You know, there's still some edge cases where some of the map functionality isn't accessible and they're still working on it. But generally it's not really something you have control over. It's something that is up to Google. You know, so you just want to make sure how you embed it and how you allow people to use their interface, if that makes sense. Yes, in the back?
Hey, you had mentioned the audio description session from yesterday a couple of times.
Yes.
That was mine, so I thought I'd just say, hey, I'll come in and say hey to you afterwards, and if anyone wants to talk audio description of what we did yesterday,
Yeah.
I have to be in the room, so no big.
But, cool, yeah. Yeah. Have any questions? Anything up over here? Yeah?
Since someone mentioned Google Maps, I'm going to suggest another resource to everybody. There, for maps, when you're mapping different areas with colors, there's a really nice website called Color Brewer that allows you to pick color palettes to use when you're mapping resources that that are more legible by folks who have color perception problems, color blindness, that sort of thing. Also makes it easier to print things. And in addition to map utilization, I find it useful when you're putting color charts up on the web to use your palettes, so it's easier for folks to read the data, perceive the data, than having folks just pick colors that they like if they may have better visual acuity than your customers.
What site was that again?
Color Brewer.
Yeah, go ahead.
At the beginning, it said that only government sites have to be 508 compliant, and that not private organizations or.
So.
But I was wondering too if there's sort of an exception for a case like a university that receives government funding.
Right, so it's up to the agency. So all government agencies are bound by Section 508. And so sometimes they'll give grants to nonprofits or other organizations to do stuff. And most often they'll put in the clause that it has to be accessible to Section 508, So if you're not in that situation and you're just a private company, you're just using, you're just using your own, you're not dependent on the government for funding or whatever to do that. You don't need to follow Section 508. But you still need to be accessible. So like you're still open to lawsuits from, somebody that can't access the site. Just like what happened with Target, 8 years ago now. So you basically end up following the WCAG 2.0 regardless anywhere. And that's usually where anybody that creates a site from scratch, they're doing that anyway. So the Section 508 refresh, all I would basically say is now you're just following the rules everybody else was following. So, any other questions? Yeah?
This question is about default activation of accessibility features. Your text mentioned about audio description that it should not be on by default. What about captions? I've heard the argument that captions should be on by default because the sighted user can easily turn it off, whereas the non-sighted user would have to then possibly miss some of the content in the beginning and have to back up after turning captions on.
So as long as it's easily enabled, that's the only thing you're bound by. But again, as with everything on the web, you want to do things that are the most usable for people. And so it depends on your audience. So like if you do have a large percent that are, that really need those closed captioning, maybe enabling it by default works better. So that there's this whole range of making things accessible. And just like with usability, you're never going to have a website that is 100% accessible. Because that means it has absolutely no problems anywhere else in the world, even if they're in a different language or can't read at all, they can understand your website. So it's not about being 100% accessible. It's about being as accessible as you can within your budget, within your time scope, that still makes it usable for the largest percentage of the users. Any other questions? Yep.
Are there open source rich text editors or WYSIWYG editors that are more compliant?
CK Editor, I know they're the most recent version that they came out with 3 years ago. They did a lot of work and it's pretty accessible out of the box. I would assume Tiny MCE as well, because they use it in WordPress and they're pretty good about it.
I've heard.
Yeah, so it's. Any other questions? No? No? I thought I saw one in back. Oh, yeah, back there.
I agree with everything that you said about using captchas for spam prevention, but if we're in a situation where all of our other spam prevention methods have failed, so we're trying a captcha anyway, are there certain ones that you like better or worse than others?
Oh, for CAPTCHA?
Yeah.
Not really. Unfortunately. So like I was always, like, until last week, I would have recommended reCAPTCHA, which is what they use on a DrupalGov site, but I couldn't get through it,
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, going once, twice. Okay, well, thanks for coming to the session.